Yeah, my friend does like a house. Yes. Yeah. I think they do get
All right, well, welcome everyone to tonight's lecture. My name is Sadie Thayer, and I'm the director here. So it's my pleasure to welcome everyone, especially as we come to the end of our spring portion of our series. We'll be back in the fall with 4 more. But our lecture series is made possible by our members. So I especially want to thank everyone who's a member in tonight's crowd. And if you're not, please consider becoming a member. It's solely our membership dues that make our lecture series possible, along with generous support and contributions in our partnership with Humanities Washington. So tonight's presentation is the first in the U.S. Green Berets in Vietnam, 1957, with our presenter, Hank Cramer, who is a traveling folk singer and a historian based in Winthrop. He is also a retired U.S. Army officer, and he's presented programs of history and music for Humanities Washington all across the years. We've had him here for Songs of the Civil War. We've had him here for Songs of the Oregon Trail and a wide variety. He's even been featured as the special guest of our fundraiser a time or two. So Hank was also the 2011 recipient of the prestigious Humanities Washington Award, and the reason we're here tonight, he is writing a book on tonight's topic. So please join me in welcoming Hank Cramer.
It's just a little bit here. Over here. Well, thank you everybody for turning out tonight, and thank you Sadie and Kittitas County Historical Museum for having me here tonight. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah.
Am I too loud? Okay, shut up. Okay. Well, tonight I'm here to talk about a chapter of the Vietnam War that probably most of you don't know anything about. I've had to do a lot of digging to find out myself. It's interesting to talk about the topic of the Vietnam War because we've got such a range of people here with different perspectives. Could I start out by asking all Vietnam War veterans in the room if you'd raise your hand? Thank you. Thank you for your service to the parts of the world. And I'm also curious, could I see a show of hands of everyone here who was born after the Vietnam War ended? Okay, so thank you very much for that. And so share some perspectives. Anyway, the Vietnam War was a huge, huge event for America. It has really grabbed the attention of our historians, and it's really grabbed our popular culture with movies and TV shows and so on and so forth. And the history that we know and the popular culture that we understand is 500,000 American soldiers over in South Vietnam fighting a counterinsurgency against a guerrilla uprising. The soundtrack of that is the beat of Huey helicopters everywhere, UH-1, flying people in, flying people out, so on and so forth. So I'm going to take you on a different kind of journey tonight. Even some of you Vietnam veterans might find this a totally different chapter from anything you saw before. I'm going to take you back to a time, 1957, when there were no helicopters whatsoever in Vietnam, when a Viet Cong rebellion or insurgency had not broken out. There were about 700 Americans in Vietnam at that time, none of whom carried weapons. The only armed Americans in Vietnam in 1957 are the men that you're looking at on the screen up here. These are the soldiers of the 14th Special Forces Detachment. The guy standing in the, you'll meet all of them before this presentation is over. The guy standing in the middle is my father, Captain Harry Cramer. He was the commander of the 14th Special Forces. Of the people in this room, I'd take a pretty good guess or a pretty good gamble that I'm the first person who heard of Vietnam, because almost 59,000 American soldiers were killed. Soldiers, sailors, and airmen were killed during the course of the war. My father was the first. He died on October 21st, 1957. We got the word on the morning of October 22nd. So I'm the first kid in America who lost a parent in the war, and that stuck with me ever since. So it got me digging into the story. It started, I guess the story for me begins with Veterans Day of 1982. They opened up a memorial in Washington, D.C., known as the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. Most of us simply call it the Wall, and it has the names of the 59,000 Americans who were lost in the war. And when they opened that memorial, they left my father's name on. His name was absent. And obviously, I was upset about that. And I wanted to find out why, and that starts us on the journey I'm going to share with you tonight. Turns out that his name was left off because the mission these men were performing in 1957 was secret, and nobody particularly wanted to remember that in the Pentagon, and no one wanted to take initiative to establish that fact. So I'll make short shrift of that. I demanded the documents that supported my case, and we won a battle. And on Veterans Day of 1983, 1 year after they opened the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, they added my dad's name to the Vietnam Wall. And now he is generally recognized as the first American casualty in the war. But that's just part of the story. So what I'll do is I'll launch into this slideshow and tell you how they got to be there. That's one of the part of the story. What did they intend to do there? Because what President Eisenhower wanted to do in Vietnam in 1957 was much different from what John F. Kennedy wanted to do in Vietnam in 1962, or what Lyndon Johnson wanted to do in Vietnam in 1965, or what Richard Nixon wanted to do in Vietnam in 1969. Much different. So what were they doing there? What was the plan? As I've gone on this journey to really fill in the story, I've had to meet the families of all the men in that picture. All but one of them are gone now. But I've met with their sons and their daughters and their grandchildren and pieced this story together. And you're not only going to meet all these guys, but I'll tell you what happened to them before we get done. So I'll move on to the first slide. I hate to read slides because you can read for yourself, but I'll sum it up. They deployed in June of 1957. They were the first team of Green Berets, that's what Special Forces are nicknamed, the Green Berets, to go to Vietnam. Putting the bottom line right up front, the next paragraph explains the reason why the Department of Defense did not want to disclose my father's death. Even in 1982, the mission was not to train South Vietnamese to defend South Vietnam. The mission was to train a group of North Vietnamese refugees from the communist North, train them to parachute them back into North Vietnam, and create a guerrilla uprising against the North Vietnamese government, which would keep them too busy to even contemplate invading South Vietnam. Imagine that. That was the task. And again, my father commanded the team. This is their story. You got to take yourself mentally back to the 1950s, and I'll give you some refreshers here. When this team deployed, Dwight Eisenhower was the President of the United States. He commanded the Overlord invasion, which started 75 years ago tonight. Five-star General Eisenhower commanded the invasion of Europe and won the battle over the Nazis. He was retired during the Korean War, which was pretty traumatizing for America. The Korea is now called the Forgotten War. We lost almost as many soldiers as we did in Vietnam, and we didn't want to remember it. Dwight Eisenhower got elected president in 1952, partly on the platform that he was going to get the war done, and Americans wanted an ex-general who knew a way to solve this seemingly endless and pointless war that we were in. So when Eisenhower becomes president, he views the world this way. First of all, Europe is our focus. They are our largest trading partner. They're the people that we just rescued from the Nazis, and they are now threatened by the Soviet Union and communism. And a lot of people today take that as an empty threat. Oh yeah, everybody's paranoid about the communists. They thought they were the boogeyman. Let me tell you, they were the boogeyman. They cut off West Berlin from the rest of Germany and would have starved those people out had we not thrown food supplies in. They invaded Hungary. They invaded Czechoslovakia. They threatened at every turn to invade Western Europe and staged a communist uprising in Greece. The threat was very, very real. And Eisenhower said that's our #1 priority, is to keep Western Europe from being overrun by the Soviets. And all the U.S. Army troops that were available pretty much were stationed in Germany to contain that threat. Asia was a secondary concern. Imagine a time when Asia wasn't our biggest trading partner. No, Japan and China didn't have the trade surpluses they have today. It was a different time. We were afraid of Chinese expansion. There's always been more of them than there are of us. The Korean War was very disappointing. We went in for very limited goals, simply to restore the status quo. We lost 40,000 Americans in that war to no good end from the point of view of the American people. It wasn't our country, and we didn't win the war. We simply lost 40,000 lives to keep the status quo. And out in the Pacific, most of our strength, then and now, was the U.S. Air Force and the U.S. Navy. We can bomb a lot of folks, but we don't have boots on the ground. Uh-oh, let's cross this one over here. Go on. Get back up. Why is it doing that? Sadie?
It says remind me
Remind me
tomorrow.
tomorrow.
Where's your
Your computer.
Yeah, just too this.
I don't think we want to be started.
What's it remind me tomorrow?
I'm in line. There we go. Is that a touchscreen?
No, it's not. Here,
Okay.
real quick. Sorry.
Thank you, technical support. Okay. I thought we had a showstopper there. Let's move along before it happens again. Meanwhile, in Asia, we have another problem. When Franklin D. Roosevelt was president during World War II, we had a great alliance with the British and with the French and with a number of other allies. And in Europe, it was pretty clear cut. We were trying to keep the Nazis out of England and help recover France from Nazi control. But throughout the war, as we spent more and more resources and lives in the Pacific and Southeast Asia, Roosevelt made it clear to our allies that we are not spending American lives and American money to restore colonial empires in Asia. And that message came across loud and clear to the British, and partly because of Roosevelt's diplomacy, Britain gave India and Pakistan and Burma their independence following World War II, much as FDR and most of the American leadership wanted to happen. Not so the French. Following World War II, they wanted to regain their lost colony in Indochina. It was captured by the Japanese, but it was kind of interesting. I don't want to digress, but there's so many interesting threads to this. That was a French colony before the war. Japan wanted to invade it. You follow me on this? But then France was overrun by the Nazis, so the new French government, the Vichy, which were sympathetic with the Nazis, told the Japanese, it's okay, you can occupy it as long as you don't mess with French business and don't mess with French local colonial administration. But you may occupy it without opposition as long as you leave the French business and government owned. The Japanese said fine. So ironically, during the course of World War II, the only people who actually fought the Japanese were communist guerrillas, the Viet Minh, led by Ho Chi Minh. Makes it awkward for us later. Anyway, France decides to fight this colonial war, and it goes on from 1946 right up through 1954. We don't really want any part of it, but we can't abandon an ally who's fighting the communists because of our political theories at the time. So we give them weapons, we give them ammunition, we give them money, we give them advice, but they won't take it. I'll express opinions from time to time, but that's the decided opinion of all the Joint Chiefs of Staff and most military historians. Any advice we gave them, they ignored. We gave them covert air support through the CIA. We had a private airline which flew combat support missions for the French back then. Eisenhower and the U.S. government were asked repeatedly to intervene, and all of the Joint Chiefs of Staff were the heads of the Air Force, the Navy, the Army, the Marine Corps. Did I miss anybody? Anyway, the Air Force and Navy chiefs all said, oh yeah, we can go in and we can bomb the cheeses out of Southeast Asia in support of the French. There was only one dissenting voice, and that was Matthew Ridgway, four-star general, paratrooper at Normandy, who had been the final American commander in Korea. He said no, and he was a minority voice. but his opinion counted with Eisenhower. We refused to intervene on behalf of the French. The French defeat comes in 1954. They send a 10,000-man paratroop division to a very remote location in the mountains of North Vietnam against our advice. And that division gets surrounded and forced to surrender en masse. And when the French lose a 10,000-man division of paratroopers, it is over. The result of that, oh, and I should have said when I got started, usually in presentations I ask everybody to hold questions till the end. This is a pretty long presentation, so if you do have questions as we go along, it's probably better to ask them right as we get there. But if you do, talk loud because I'm a little hard to hear. Okay, so Vietnam gets divided at the 17th parallel. We're kind of in the habit of that. We divided East and West Germany, we divided North and South Korea. The French and the Communists decide the same thing. They'll divide Vietnam in half into North Vietnam and South Vietnam. The North is governed by the Communists under Ho Chi Minh. The South, we have a disagreement. The French agree to give up North Vietnam, but in the South, they want status quo. They have an emperor, Bao Dai. He's the traditional emperor of Vietnam. He doesn't live in Vietnam. He lives in Marseille on the south coast of France. And he runs criminal syndicates. He runs the mafia in Vietnam. The French want him because he'll do what the French say. The United States says no. They support a non-communist nationalist. His name is Ngo Dinh Diem. And we support him for president, and we get our way because we're the guys with the checkbook. We allow, all the parties involved allow migration from one side to the other. Anyone from the south who wants to go north is welcome to. Anyone from the north who wants to go south, they're welcome to. There is massive migration from the north into the south to get away from the communists. Practically nobody moves from the south to the north. Nobody's having that. And we also agree that we will advise and assist the South Vietnamese government and army, but not until the French leave. We are tired of working with that party. So this is what former Indochina looks like when we're done. The area in red, north of the 17th parallel, that is established as North Vietnam, run by Ho Chi Minh. The area to the south is South Vietnam, an independent republic. They are supposed to hold elections in a couple of years afterwards. All foreign military advisors are supposed to leave, but they finally negotiate that 300 American advisors, unarmed advisors, can stay behind to advise the Vietnamese military. But that's the maximum number allowed. From 1954 to 1956, over 500,000 refugees moved from the North Vietnam to the south. Much of that is fear of the communists. The other part is religious orientation. Because it was a French colony, much of the population of Vietnam is Catholic, and they fear severe reprisals against Catholics by the communists. So the picture on the left shows a U.S. Navy ship in Ha Long Bay. The U.S. Navy provided the sea lift to get all these refugees to the south. The fellow on the right, his name is Tom Dooley, and I'm not talking about the guy in the Kingston Trio song. This is an American Navy doctor who volunteers to do medical services for all the refugees coming out of the north. And he becomes very impassioned about the trials and troubles they're going through. He writes a series of books, first one called Deliver Us from Evil, which is about getting these refugees out of the horrible oppression they're facing in the north. And he becomes, actually in 1956, Time magazine voted him as the most popular man in America. Who's heard of that name? Anybody still remember Tom Dooley? It's kind of faded away. That's Matthew Ridgway, the old paratrooper. He used to wear, on his field uniform, he used to wear hand grenades on his field jacket to let you know he meant business. When asked about sending American troops to Vietnam, he called it the wrong war, in the wrong place, at the wrong time. His plan is to provide assistance to Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, the other former French colonies, assist them in preserving their independence. But in his war plans, which he puts together, Thailand is what we call the red line. We will help the other countries defend against the North Vietnamese or Chinese invasion, but not with inserting American troops. But if anybody threatens Thailand, then the U.S. goes to war. And you'll see geographically why that's the case in just a moment. Well, this is President Ngo Dinh Diem, the new leader of South Vietnam, flying to Washington, D.C. to meet Dwight Eisenhower in 1955. Okay, so this is the plan. We're going to support the independence of Vietnam, but at minimum risk of U.S. investment. To that end, we formed something that's called a Military Assistance and Advisory Group, and this isn't unique, this is typical in any third world country that's trying to help. We set up an office near the embassy and we provide some advisors. But putting it bluntly, the Department of Defense and the State Department moved very slowly in, first of all, putting together a plan, estimating the situation, then they have to coordinate with each other to make sure they're in agreement, and they can come to the National Security Council and give a coherent statement, but it takes quite a while. Eisenhower was impatient, so he had a CIA director, Allen Dulles, send a very special team. As far as I can tell, there's been nothing like it since, called the Saigon Military Mission, to go in, make rapid assessments, plan for the contingencies that might happen before we can come up with a real plan, and start taking immediate action. This is Colonel Ed Lansdale. He's a military officer who's appointed to head the CIA Saigon military mission. What's unique is none of these guys are civilians. They are all military officers on short-term loan to the CIA to go get this thing done. He actually becomes a famous character. There was a book called The Ugly American. Did anybody read that way back when? And it was all about all the confusion and policy and stuff, trying to deal with this insurgency in this third world country. They didn't call it Vietnam, they called it Sarkan in the book. And The Ugly American is the ambassador who just doesn't get it. But he has an advisor in the book called Colonel Hillendale, who's trying to give him the straight dope and tell him what he needs to do. Colonel Hillendale is based on Edward G. Lansdale, right here. Lansdale had helped solve a communist insurgency in the Philippines 5 years prior to this, with no American troops on the ground. He gave advice to the president of the Philippines, President Magsaysay, and helped steer the Philippines through the suppression of a communist rebellion with no American troops, which is why Eisenhower likes this guy. Now, he reports directly to the director of the CIA, Allen Dulles. People don't realize that. A couple of ambassadors get fired because they don't understand that. A couple of generals get fired because they don't realize Lansdale doesn't work for them. He works for Allen Dulles, the head of the CIA, who coincidentally is brother of John Foster Dulles, the Secretary of State. So what I'm trying to say is Lansdale is a very powerful guy. He's going to take action, and whatever you do, don't get in his way. One of the things that Lansdale figures out very quickly, and his team, is that the French did a terrible job of fighting the war, but they had one outfit that was very successful, called the GCMA. That is an acronym for the French term, I'm terrible at French, Groupement Commandos Mixtes Aeroportos, the mixed airborne and commando group. They were all indigenous people. They were tribesmen from up in the hills, and the French organized them, put some officers in charge of them, armed them, and they were kicking butt, excuse my French, French, all over Vietnam. That was the only successful aspect of the French war, and Lansdale latches onto that immediately. So we're going to talk about unconventional warfare here for a moment, and a lot of people don't understand. The guy in front row knows what that is, but a lot of you guys know what unconventional warfare is. During World War II, we learned all about it. We sort of understood guerrilla warfare and the Revolutionary War because that's what we did, but we didn't institutionalize that. But during World War II, we faced a couple of situations. One is that the Germans kicked everybody out of the mainland of Europe. So we organized guerrilla warfare in Europe. We had an outfit called the Office of Strategic Services, and we organized little teams. There were three-man teams with one American, one Brit, and one Frenchman on each team, and we would parachute them behind enemy lines, not for three guys to attack the Nazis. That doesn't make any sense. Three guys can land, make contact with the local population, find out who hates the Nazis, which is everybody, organize them into resistance groups, and then get on the radio and call for hand grenades, machine guns, rifles, all that sort of stuff. This was guerrilla warfare practiced in Europe. It was offensive. We were jumping into the Germans' backyard and causing havoc for them. We stumbled across a different form of guerrilla warfare in the Pacific. The Japanese overran the Philippines, which people forget was U.S. territory during World War II. The Japanese overran the Philippines, and most American troops surrendered at the Bataan Peninsula. But a lot of American troops were left behind in the jungle. And after the American surrender, they got together with the local Filipino guerrillas. Some of them were cops, some of them were bandits, some of them were ex-Filipino military. They organized what we call a stay-behind operation. It wasn't planned, but the enemy just took this place over, and here I am sitting in the jungle. So let's make things hard for the Japanese. And so we learned a different form called stay-behind. Those are OSS agents 75 years ago preparing to jump into Nazi-occupied France from a B-24 bomber there. He didn't have doors to jump out of, he just sat at the bottom. They opened the bomb bay doors and dropped you out. It must have been really exciting. This is a picture from a stay-behind operation in the Philippines. On the sides you see U.S. soldiers. Filipino guerrillas have captured the Japanese. This was very successful throughout the war. We tied down, they didn't eject the Japanese, but the Filipino guerrillas kept so many Japanese tied down. Those were Japanese soldiers who could not fight at Guadalcanal or Okinawa or Iwo Jima. They couldn't go anywhere else because they were tied down by the Filipino guerrillas. Guerrilla warfare can be vicious and it can be brutal. My personal opinion is that those 2 United States soldiers were not standing there. Those Japanese prisoners wouldn't be alive very much longer. After the war, they broke up the OSS. It did intelligence and guerrilla warfare during World War II. They decided to create 2 new organizations. The organization put in charge of gathering intelligence was the CIA. You've all read 50 novels about them. And the organization to conduct guerrilla warfare, their insignia is on the right, that was the U.S. Army Special Forces. So they split the responsibilities into 2 different organizations. But in the early days, there was a lot of, call it cross-pollination, if you were a botanist, I suppose. A lot of Army guys went to the CIA after the war. A lot of OSS guys went to the Army Special Forces, and then sort of traveled back and forth over the early years. So here's what the Saigon military mission did, pretty quickly. There was a 2-year period that everybody had to evacuate North Vietnam from 1954 to 1956. So they went out, they established contacts with all the dissident groups who were non-communist. They buried supply caches all over North Vietnam, weapons, radios, ammunition, etc. They looked at what is the likeliest thing to happen to South Vietnam. And this is interesting, and I'll take a moment on this one because it goes against our cultural interpretation of the Vietnam War. They sized everything up and decided that the communist rebels, the insurgents in the South, were very, very weak. If anything bad was going to happen to South Vietnam, it was either that North Vietnam was going to invade right across the 17th parallel, bring tanks and artillery and attack right into South Vietnam, or if the North Vietnamese didn't do it, the Chinese would do it. A conventional invasion directly into South Vietnam was the most likely thing that was going to happen. And they were absolutely correct. That's what happened in 1973 to 1975. Popular American culture holds that the Viet Cong rebels in the South defeated the U.S. Army and then the South Vietnamese government collapsed. No, the entire war wore the United States out personally, and when the United States troops withdrew, the Viet Cong did not overthrow the South Vietnamese government. The North Vietnamese invaded South Vietnam across the 17th parallel in something that looked like a German Blitzkrieg movie from 1940. It was tanks that rolled into Saigon and fired into the National Palace. So anyway, brief digression. Anyway, they figure that's the most dangerous course of action. They recommend the quickest thing that we can do to stave this off is form a Vietnamese Special Forces with offensive guerrilla warfare capability so they can send them into the north and create so much havoc. Just like the Filipinos tied down the Japanese in the Philippines, these guys could make the North Vietnamese army so busy they wouldn't have time to think about invading the South. And then the other possibility was, if the North Vietnamese invade before we're done getting these guys ready, then they can be stay behind. They can simply shrink into the woods, wait, and then start a rebellion in South Vietnam against the communists. But actually training those guerrillas is outside the scope of the CIA, so they request and get a U.S. Special Forces team to do the job. So we got to get Special Forces over the Pacific right away. There's 2 different needs. First of all, the Saigon military mission wants 1 team right now. But the commander, the 4-star admiral who's in charge of the entire Pacific, he gets it. He wants a whole Special Forces group of several hundred men. He wants them out there to respond throughout Asia, to the Philippines, to Korea, to Burma, wherever needed. So that's a pretty tall order because at this point, Special Forces is still pretty small. They've already got the location picked out. That is the island of Okinawa. In the 1950s, it was a U.S. protectorate, still controlled by us after the war. It has gone back to Japanese rule now, even though the Okinawan people are ethnically not Japanese. They're a separate indigenous people. But anyway, you see that red star, that's Okinawa. And if you look at the distance from Okinawa to Korea, to the Soviet ports of Vladivostok, to anywhere in China, to Taiwan, to Vietnam, to Burma, and the Philippines is off the map, but just down here. Okinawa is the key to all of that. So the short-term need is get a team to Vietnam, but the long-term need is we need to get a special forces group based on Okinawa. First thing they do is they pick the man, and the man is an OSS CIA kind of guy. His name is Scott Matting from Arkansas. During World War II, early in World War II, they put him through a crash course in Chinese at Yale University. Then they sent him to Southeast Asia, where he fought with a legendary guerrilla group called Merrill's Marauders. Then he went on to work for the OSS. During the Korean War, he was a CIA operations officer in charge of putting agents behind the lines in North Korea and agents into Red China. That was his job during the war. He has close relations with most of the CIA. He personally knows everybody in the Saigon military mission. They ask for him by name. He very quickly forms his team, and there's a string of dates on the right side there, and you'll see that it progresses pretty rapidly. He gets notified in the summer of 1955, get a team ready to go to Vietnam ASAP. He organizes the team at Fort Bragg, North Carolina in 1955. They move to Hawaii in 1956 to be closer, and then you'll see they go to Thailand, Taiwan, and Vietnam in very rapid order to train indigenous forces. This is a little bit about Special Forces. That's their old insignia. It's changed now, but hey, this is 1957, so that's their insignia. And their theme, anything, anytime, any place, anyhow, they can do it. All of them have to be volunteers. You don't put draftees into Special Forces. This is going to be dangerous. You gotta knowingly put yourself at risk to join this outfit. Everyone must be a parachutist. Everyone must speak a foreign language. And then they learned this structure from those OSS teams in World War II. Once you go behind enemy lines, you're going to be absolutely self-sufficient. So it's not on the slide here, but there's no privates, there's no corporals in the Special Forces. All of them are experienced sergeants with a small handful of officers, and every one of them is a master of at least one of these specialties. Operations and intelligence. Operations is planning what we're going to do. Intelligence is finding out what are they going to do. Communications, and I don't just mean short-range communications, I mean long-range clandestine communications that you can send a message home all the way from behind Russian lines, that kind of communications. Medics who were trained, they didn't have the term PA or paramedic back then, but these Special Forces medics were trained as close to the level of ND as they could. I mean, they were far beyond a normal Army medic. The weapons men, and they not only knew every weapon in the U.S. inventory, but if they're going to fight behind enemy lines, they have to know all the Russian and German and Chinese weapons as well. And then the demolitions guys, they love to blow things up. Today we call them engineers because demolition sounds so violent. But anyway, they were demolitions guys back then. Their symbol was the Green Beret. It was outlawed back then, by the way. But they inherited that from the OSS in World War II, and they had adopted that as their headgear, but the Army outlawed it. But they wore it covertly anyway because they're Special Forces, and they can do whatever they want, as long as they don't get caught. If they get caught, they'll deny it. But anyway, the beret on top there on the right is my father's. The beret underneath is mine, 1957 and 1984. So I'm going to introduce the guys to you, and move along, okay? Because it's all about the team. It's all about the people. They just don't rubber stamp these organizations and say, this 14th detachment did this. It's important to know who they were, and over the last few years I've spent a lot of time finding out exactly who they were, getting their military records from the National Archives, and traveling around the country to meet their families. Anyway, on the left is Lieutenant Colonel Scott Matting. I already introduced him. He's the commander of the outfit. He's 39 years old, and his U.S. parachute wings are over here, but on this chest are all his foreign parachute wings. He's been a few places. What a character. His top sergeant is Sergeant Major Robert Voss from Washington, Missouri. He parachuted into Europe with the 101st Airborne Division in World War II, and he also, like Matting, he inserted agents behind lines in North Korea and China. Matting did not know that Voss was 28 years old Voss's military record said he was 29 years old because he lied about his age to enlist in the Army in World War II. And once you lie to the Army, you can never go back and admit it because they'll discharge you from the Army dishonorably for lying to the Army. So anyway, I first learned of his true age last year when I went and visited him in St. Louis, Missouri. Anyway, he was 28 years old. He was the top sergeant of that team. The officers, the second in command, the executive officer, was Major Don O'Rourke. 75 years ago tonight, he parachuted into Normandy with the 82nd Airborne Division. The fellow on the right is my father, Captain Harry Cramer from Johnstown, Pennsylvania, in charge of operations and intelligence. He was a kid. He missed World War II. He entered the Army in 1946. He was too young for the war. But he earned the Silver Star and was wounded twice during the Korean War and was one of the original Special Forces guys. Operations and intelligence, two guys running that, Master Sergeant Francis Ruddy and Master Sergeant Henry First. Ruddy jumped into Europe with the 82nd Airborne Division, and so did First, and both from Pennsylvania, incidentally. Communications, the comm chief was Master Sergeant Fred Williamson from Pontiac, Michigan. During the Korean War, he ran long-distance radio communications to agents in North Korea and Red China. Not agents in South Korea, where we were. No, he ran communications to agents behind enemy lines, trained them how to do it, and then manned the radio at the other end of the communications. And Don Stetson to the right, he was described as a guy who'd go into a junkyard, pick up a bunch of spare parts, and build you a radio in 1 hour and be talking halfway across the world with it. And it was Don Stetson. The medics, Sergeant Lester Rupert from upstate New York, he was a junior medic, and Sergeant First Class Chalmers Archer from Mississippi on the right was a senior medic. The weapons guys, Bobby Newman, he was a light weapons guy, he was a paratrooper, he jumped twice in Korea, he had a score to settle. His older brother Cecil Newman was a West Point graduate class of 1949, also a World War II veteran who had earned the Silver Star as an enlisted man in World War II. Cecil Newman was deployed into Korea immediately when the North Koreans invaded. And Cecil Newman, the older brother, and his platoon were overrun and captured by the North Koreans. They surrendered. They were found 2 days later when the Americans counterattacked. All of them had had their hands wired behind their back and shot in the head. Bobby Newman stayed in the Army to kill communists. He knew why he was there. Sergeant Everett White on the right was a heavy weapons guy. He was a Navy anti-aircraft gunner in World War II, served in both theaters, Atlantic and Pacific. Parachuted into Korea during the war and came onto the team as the heavy weapons guy. Special skills, they only had one demolitions guy instead of two because everybody else on the team had demolitions as their secondary. So they got this little Hawaiian fellow, 23-year-old Earl Kalani, who went on to be a legend. Anyway, he was the one demolitions guy. And they grabbed one guy they weren't authorized to have. Back at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, where everybody gets special forces training, there's a guy called the guerrilla chief. And as the special forces candidates go out into the forest and try to negotiate with the guerrillas, the guy who speaks a foreign language is very difficult to deal with. This guerrilla chief. He's pretending he's the Yugoslavian or the Tibetan or the Argentinian that you're trying to deal with. His name was Ray LaBombard. And Matty said, we're going to go teach guys in foreign countries how to be special forces guerrillas. We need the guerrilla chief. So they grabbed Ray LaBombard. Because they were traveling alone, they needed a parachute rigger. That was Master Sergeant Don Reynolds. Unique background, he parachuted to North Africa and New Guinea and the Philippines and Korea in combat and came in to be their rigger and also their supply guy. Before they could move the team out, they recruited them all-star team for sure, but there were two major exercises that they had to go on. You want to take your guys to the field and put them under stress and see if you really pick the right guys. So first they go down to Louisiana, for a huge exercise called Sagebrush in 1955. It's 130,000 soldiers on the ground, good guys and bad guys, blue forces and red forces, and about 1,500 Air Force planes flying overhead. And they took about 200 Special Forces guys and inserted them into the bayous of Louisiana to make life hard for the 50,000 troops or so who were the bad guys, the red forces. They placed dummy charges on every road bridge that was critical. They ambushed supply columns way in the rear of the enemy's area and avoided contact with the enemy's combat forces. Anyway, these 200 guys, by the end of 2 weeks, they caused so much havoc in this exercise in Louisiana that the general ordered them out of the field. Not because they were unsuccessful. They were too successful. They were screwing up the whole war game. So anyway, that's a gold star for Maddox team. From there, they got to deploy to mountain warfare because they might end up someday in Manchuria. They might end up someday in Siberia. They might end up someday in Nepal. So they parachuted into Camp Hale, Colorado, 10,000 feet above sea level, which means you got to jump out of the plane 11,500 feet above sea level. The highest static line parachute jump ever made by the Army up to that point. And then once they got on the ground, they learned to ski, they learned how to toboggan, and most importantly, they learned how to survive. Winter is and altitude are your biggest enemies in that environment. They moved to Hawaii in April 1956. This is trivia, but the Army jumps with these heavy steel helmets. They're really uncomfortable with all the straps. Major O'Rourke went up to the smoke jumper school in Missoula, Montana, and found that the smoke jumpers had custom-made fiberglass helmets that were comfortable and gave you better protection. So he pried enough smoke jumper helmets for the 14th Detachment. That's Earl Kalani landing in Hawaii with a smoke jumper helmet on. They had 6 months to train. They had to get together with the staff of the Commander-in-Chief Pacific to find out what are all your war plans out there. And then this is unique to the Special Forces guys. They're going to go work with indigenous people, and in many places they're going to be the only Americans there. So everybody on the team, from the highest to the lowest ranking guy, is reading everything there is to read about Thailand, about Taiwan, and Vietnam. They're taking language classes. Most of the guys on the team speak Chinese, so that might work in many places. But nevertheless, they all start with elementary Vietnamese and Thai to make sure they can at least give instruction in those languages. They debrief a number of people, including at the time, I guess it still exists, a Fulbright scholarship program. Under the name of Senator Fulbright, we gave scholarships to promising students from throughout Asia to come to American universities. We intercepted them coming and going to visit, just spend an afternoon and have tea with the 14th Special Forces Detachment and tell them about Chiang Mai, tell them about Da Nang, tell them about Taipei. And so that's how they gained area knowledge. How am I doing so far? Anybody sleep? No boring back there? No snoring. Tom Dooley briefed the team, and in fact, this is kind of a touchy subject. Tom Dooley was a U.S. Navy officer and a medical doctor who helped rescue all those refugees, but he was also an asset to the CIA. That does not mean he was a paid CIA employee. It means he was a Navy officer with a top secret clearance, and anything that was important, he passed on to the CIA. And the CIA made sure that Tom Dooley was available to Dad's team. Shortly after this debriefing, Tom Dooley was diagnosed with incurable cancer, but he knew that he had a few years. So he resigned from the Navy shortly after this, and then went back to Laos and ran a clinic in the mountains of Laos for indigenous people. Stayed there until he was too sick to continue, and came back to St. Louis and died. But that's Tom Dooley's inscription in the autograph book he gave Dad to Harry Cramer, with best wishes in a task I hope you never have to do. And by that he was referring to, in World War III, this detachment, I mentioned they all spoke Chinese. In a World War III scenario, they would all go behind lines in mainland China, from which there was probably no return. So that was his personal autograph to my dad. Hawaiian life to the families there. Those are my sisters at our house in Fort Shafter, Hawaii, right in Honolulu. Dad took me swimming at Waikiki Beach on Christmas Day. And you don't do that in Washington State, nor do you do that in Alaska or anywhere else I know of. More Hawaiian life. Earl Kalani, the Hawaiian fellow, that's him in the middle. He's serenading Sergeant White's wife and daughter. Cindy White is my age. She's the little girl sitting in front of Earl Kalani. She still remembers. He had the most beat-up ukulele in the world. It had masking tape holding it together. But he entertained all the families with genuine Hawaiian music while they were in Hawaii. And over on the right, that's Les Rupert, the junior medic, 23 years old. He has taken a shine to the daughter of Master Sergeant Crane Ruddy, his boss. You got to be real careful when you're a junior sergeant. You decide you're going to date the top sergeant's daughter. You probably better get permission. But that's him and Roxanne horseback riding on Oahu. And the romance continues. That's her riding piggyback on her shoulders back from the beach, and that's them sitting in Ruddy's kitchen. Before they deploy to Vietnam, Les Rupert asks Roxanne to marry him, and she says yes, and he gives her the engagement ring before they ship out. And the mission preparation continues. This is kind of a Hollywood picture. They were dirty and grubby and running around, mostly around in the jungles in Maui, because that was much more like the jungles that be in Vietnam than the rest of the terrain on Oahu. So they went to Maui to train, but this is getting ready to make a parachute jump from Hickam Field. And that's Don Reynolds, the rigger, is there on the left. Major O'Rourke, the executive officer there. There's a retired brigadier general who flew parachutes in Normandy, and he wanted to come out and fly the plane. They said, okay, that guy's a real pilot. That's Fred Williamson, the communications chief, and that's Ray Bombard, the guerrilla chief. That's just to illustrate the continued training. They did a smart thing. Vietnam wanted their special forces trained, but Thailand also wanted their special forces trained. Vietnam was under greater threat, but Matting decided and he negotiated to go to Thailand first for a couple of reasons. One is, Thailand has an absolutely stable government. They've never been anyone's colony. The Thai government was legitimate and stable, and the Thai army was very professional and very stable. So what they decided to do was, they didn't use this term for fear of insulting anyone, but Thailand was a dry run for Vietnam. They went to Thailand for 3 months. Vietnam would be 6, but they went to Thailand for 3 months, went to the Special Forces camp at Beret, and they trained the Royal Thai Special Forces, who were very proactive, very tough, very good soldiers. It all went very, very well. Coming back to a map of Indochina, throughout the Vietnam War, Thailand will become the Rock of Gibraltar, if you will. And the U.S. and the Thai governments agreed to try to minimize publicity about that as much as possible. But Thailand, like I said, is a stable government. They respect the king. They love the king. It's against the law to insult the king in Thailand. A very effective and stable army. And they have what we call interior lines. They're surrounded by countries, very unstable situations. But here's Thailand in here. It starts all the way down here by Malaysia, comes up the Kra Peninsula, and it's in here. If you have trouble in Cambodia, if you have trouble in South Vietnam, if you have trouble in Laos, if you have trouble in North Vietnam, if you have trouble in China, if you have trouble in Myanmar, Burma as they called it then, all of those are within closer reach to Thailand than they are to each other. So if you base any American forces here in Thailand, they're in easy reach of any of those trouble spots. Throughout the war, many U.S. Air Force units and many U.S. Special Forces units operated from Thailand because Thailand did not want to be identified as a participant in the war. But in fact, it was very much in their interest to quell these problems on their borders. Those are Royal Thai parachute wings, and for anybody who has ever earned foreign parachute wings, that's the set. They are big, they are gaudy, they are beautiful. What you're looking at is center. Firstly, they are silver and gold thread, bullion, embroidered in. There's the parachute on the top, the big wings extending out, and if you can't figure out what that is in the middle, that is a three-headed elephant. His name is Erawan. The Thais borrowed the three-headed elephant from the Hindus, who also worship him. And the Thais are multi-theistic. Actually, they have been overrun by Buddhist cultures and Hindu cultures and Cham cultures over the years. And what they do is they absorb everybody else's religion and culture. If you go to a temple in Thailand, on the inside it is absolutely simple, undecorated, and Buddha sits in there. Go to the outside, and all of the Hindu gods are running rampant around the outside of it. Anyway, it's kind of interesting. But just as a wiseacre remark, I was thinking to myself, if I were multi-theistic, or if I believed in many gods and I wanted a god for paratroopers, I would choose something as the god of paratroopers that normally lives in the sky and has good flying ability. Why I would pick an 8,000-pound elephant falling from the sky to be the god, but that's their business, not mine, so I'll shut up and continue. There was also another side mission, a very short one before they go to Vietnam, and this is interesting. It took a while to unpeel this one. They're getting ready to go to Vietnam, but in February of 1957, they deployed to Taiwan to do some very simple, not a full special forces course, but do some simple training with the new nationalist Chinese. We call them Taiwanese today. At the time, we called that the Republic of China, and the other one was Red China. But anyway, they were nationalist Chinese at the time. We trained their forces, but they are flying an aircraft called the C-46 Curtiss Commander. That's its picture in there. We're not flying those in the U.S. Air Force anymore. We used them in World War II, and mostly we didn't like them, mostly. But the Chinese are using them, and they have a commercial airline that's actually owned by the government called Civil Air Transport, and they fly the C-46 Curtiss Commando. So one of the reasons that the team goes to Taiwan to train these guys is so that we can familiarize ourselves with all of the jump procedures in the C-46 Curtiss Commando. Because when it comes time to insert Vietnamese agents into North Vietnam, they are not going to be flown in on U.S. Air Force aircraft, because that would be a cause of war if the North Vietnamese shot one down and they found a wreckage of an American plane. We can't send Vietnamese planes because they don't have the skill and their planes don't have the range. But the plan is that we will charter nationalist Chinese airliners, Curtiss Commandos, marked as airliners, with a crew in civilian clothes who are actually Chinese Air Force officers. They will fly the agents into North Vietnam, and in the unfortunate circumstance that a plane gets shot down, it was a Chinese airliner off course, and all of the human remains found in that aircraft will be Asian and not Caucasian. Follow my drift there? Okay. There's a Chinese paratrooper getting ready to go out the door, and by the way, if you look closely, a lot of times we have this kind of racial stereotype that Asians are very, very small. The nationalist Chinese Special Forces were handpicked. So are the South Korean Special Forces. They're big guys. They got a choice from a lot of people. They picked the big ones. So Major O'Rourke was hunkering down, but a number of those Chinese paratroopers towered over him. And anyway, that's jumping from that. I just threw this in because the C-46 Curtiss Commando is such a beautiful airplane in flight. I didn't want you guys to miss that image. Okay, so they get ready. June of 1957 is when they're going to deploy. That's when MAG and the CIA want that team, get them to Saigon now. But the problem is that the four-star admiral also decides that's the perfect time to form the new Special Forces group at Okinawa. We're going to get Fort Bragg to send over 40 or 50 more guys. The awkward part is that the 14th Detachment and Colonel Madden are key to both of those things, and they're set to happen a day apart. New Special Forces group on Okinawa on June 24th. Team goes to Vietnam on June 25th. Kind of hard to manage that. So the way they handle that is Colonel Matting and Sergeant Major Voss leave the 14th Special Forces Detachment. Colonel Matting will be the commander of the new Special Forces group, and Robert Voss will be his Sergeant Major. My father steps up to be the team commander, and Master Sergeant Francis Ruddy steps up to be the team sergeant. They depart out of Hickam Air Force Base on June 25th, 1957. It was my mom and dad's 10th wedding anniversary that day. She never saw me yet. There's Dad and Sergeant Ruddy. They look like a team, they look like a crew, and they were. So they're the new bosses. It was a long flight. Some of you, bet a lot of you guys have been to China, you've been to Japan, you've been to the Philippines and stuff like that. It's a long flight, it's 13 hours nonstop at a SeaTac. They flew from, every one of these is an 8-hour leg, 8 hours from Oahu to Wake Island. That's Wake Island. That's a postcard my dad sent me. I refueled there a couple of times in the 80s as well. It's a runway and a fuel stop. Another 8 hours from there to Guam, another 8 hours from Guam to Manila, and another 8 hours from Manila to Saigon. So quite a flight. They were tired when they got there. When they arrived, the first stop and the check-in was with that military assistance and advisory group. There's 300 advisors there, but they're unarmed. They're talking about big things like planning and logistics and stuff. They're coaching Vietnamese officers. They are not in the field and they're not armed. We got a little bit of an increase. We explained to the United Nations that we also had to recover all the military junk that the French, all the jeeps and all the cannons and all the trucks and the airplanes that we gave the French are left in Vietnam in deteriorated state. So we talked the UN into letting us send another 300 just to gather up all that junk and get it out of the country. So their headquarters is in Cho Lan in Vietnam. Today it is a car dealership, but it won't be there in a couple of weeks because they're going to tear it down for a high-rise apartment. And that's their shoulder patch for Military Assistance and Advisory Group. They get some ground rules when they check in. First of all, only the general has any clue what they're doing over there. To everybody else on the MAG headquarters, they have no business knowing what the 14th Detachment is doing there. So they're given a cover name. From here on out, they're referred to as Mobile Training Team 3A. They are given a cover story. It is said that they are training South Vietnamese Rangers to do counterinsurgency. There are no South Vietnamese Rangers. They're authorized to work and travel in civilian clothes because they're going to be far from Saigon and they're just going to blend in to the degree possible. This is a little story that I'll share with you. I've talked with a sergeant, 20-year-old sergeant who checked them in. He's down in McAllen, Texas these days. He had to get them Vietnamese concealed weapons permits because they had to carry weapons and no other U.S. advisors were allowed to carry the weapons. So he got them the Vietnamese concealed weapon permits with their photographs, and he gathered the team together to have them sign and laminate the weapons permits. And then he told them that he was going to take them down to the military police station where they could draw rifles and pistols. And he said, to which Dad and Ruddy all the soldiers grinned. And they reached inside their civilian clothing and pulled out a variety of firearms, including one of the first 44 Magnums I ever made. And then they opened up their, anyway, they came up with, they did not require any additional weapons from Saigon before moving out. And they've got to check in, they've got to arrange with MAG to do things like draw their pay each month and get paid some per diem so they can eat on the economy and things. But in fact, they work for the CIA. And there's a CIA station chief in Saigon. That's who they visit with. This is the Vietnamese group they're going to train. It's called the First Observation Group. That's a very intentionally ambiguous term. You don't want to say Vietnamese Special Forces Group or commandos that jump behind enemy lines. Don't call them that. Call First Observation Group. Now, people might think they're bird watchers. Give them a name like that. They choose 80 candidates. They're going to have 4 cycles. The Americans are going to teach the first cycle, and then if everything goes well, the Vietnamese will teach the next 3 cycles themselves. All of them are North Vietnamese. At the time, they call them Tonkinese. Tonkin is the province that is North Vietnam. They're all Tonkinese. They speak the right dialect. You know how you can tell the difference between someone from Seattle and someone from Boston or someone from Mobile. Same thing. They all speak with a Tonkinese inflection. They all have relatives in the North, and they all know the geography of the North. They are all experienced colonial soldiers, and they have served before in the French Army. That's good and bad. One of the things they're screened for, they are vetted that they are loyal to President Ngo Dinh. And that's not just like making them brown shirts or SS or something like that. The French opposed Diem becoming president, and the French, between the time Diem took over and the time the 14th Detachment arrives, the French instigated 2 different coups to attempt to overthrow Diem. Fortunately, Ed Lansdale, you met Ed Lansdale? Ed Lansdale saw it coming and hired private armies to protect Diem. The French fingerprints were all over. Anyway, Diem said, these guys are all going to be personally loyal to me. Most of them are relatives of the Diem family. And they will not report to the Vietnamese Army, which is riddled with traitors. They will report directly to the president's brother through the White House. The Vietnamese White House is also called the White House. They're going to have 2 capabilities, and I think I touched on this already. First is they can infiltrate North Vietnam and carry out offensive guerrilla warfare. That doesn't mean they have to completely overthrow the North Vietnamese government. If they cause enough trouble, it will tie down so many North Vietnamese troops and cause so much havoc, they won't have the time or energy to come down here and invade the South. If by chance South Vietnam is overrun before that happens, then they will melt into the shadows, wait for the right signals, and then commence guerrilla warfare on their own turf in South Vietnam against the communist invaders. Because of this, it is absolutely essential that neither their identities nor their mission gets compromised. If the North Vietnamese or Chinese know that we are training guerrilla soldiers to be sent into their backyard, that will cause them to start planning and take reactions to prevent it, to mitigate it. And if also the identities of these guys are disclosed, most of them still have relatives in North Vietnam. You can put together what will happen to those relatives if one of these names become disclosed and the North Vietnamese realize what he's up to while his relatives are still in reach. They said a 3-step strategy for training these guys, and we don't always do it this way. We, meaning Special Forces, thought this was really, really smart. Before the Americans even get there, they put the Vietnamese candidates, the 80 of them, through a communications training course where they've got to learn Morse code and they've got to learn how to set up antennas for what the public calls shortwave radio, what the military calls high frequency. Anyways, like ham radio, but they got to learn how to do that. They don't need the Special Forces to teach them the basic parts. They use the CIA to teach them that. And they do that before the detachment even gets there. Next step is to do parachute training, and they'll do that at Saigon and in July. And then as soon as they pass communications and parachuting, then they can go on to the rest of the course. Here's a radio train, the little town called Vung Tau. It's at the very mouth of the Mekong River, where the Mekong River meets the South China Sea. Beautiful place. It's actually a beachfront resort. If you go to Vietnam, go to Vung Tau. You get a nice 4-star hotel room for 26 bucks a night. Anyway, they've got to learn to send and receive Morse code at 20 or 15 words per minute. They've got to learn some clandestine communications techniques without going in great detail. If you've read Jean Le Carre novels and things like that, you know about leaving little rolled up notes in code in the knothole in a pine tree. You know that you pull down the middle window shade on the second floor, that lets everybody know danger, the enemy's near. Roll the window shade back up, and it means it's off. That kind of stuff. They learn those things. It's got the highest washout training, washout rate of all the training. It really doesn't matter what your IQ is, whether you're dumb, middle, or really smart. Morse code doesn't relate to your IQ. There's some Einsteins who just can't get it, and other people get it very easily. So anyway, by the time you graduate from this, the biggest discriminator is, can you send and receive 15, you think of words per minute, it's actually 500 groups. If you can send and receive 15 words per minute, you graduate. And if you don't, then we'll send you home and you don't need to know anything further about this. It's still one of the highest washout rates. 58 out of 80 are able to complete it satisfactorily. That's the RS-1 radio set designed and developed by the CIA for this use. And later on, that becomes a very early Army Special Forces radio with the US data plate on it. I think it's the Angry 109, but I'm getting rusty. That's parachute training at Saigon in July of 1957. The South Vietnamese, the French taught them how to be paratroopers. There were about 2,000 South Vietnamese paratroopers, and they had a parachute school at Tan Son Nhut, which is now the international airport for Ho Chi Minh City. And that's just a good day of parachuting. Somebody else took another picture, and I'll show this to you just because it's dramatic. Their drop zone was the riverbank along the Saigon River. It was open area, so you didn't worry about power lines and houses, but it also put on a great show for the people in Saigon. This is an aerial view of a parachute jump over the Saigon River. They all land on the bank, but they're opening over the river. And they all got out fast because there's several tangled parachutes in that picture. I'm glad I'm not one of those guys. But that was parachute training. Require 5 successful jumps to become a paratrooper, and all 58 of them passed. That's them exiting from a C-47 aircraft, and that's Major No Tay Lin rolling up his own parachute there. We'll learn more about No Tay Lin in a little while. Question comes up, why the parachute training? Well, there's one aspect to it that's practical, and there's another that's a screening technique for your soldiers. First, if you're going to get behind enemy lines, whether it's a mass assault or whether it's 1 or 2 people at a time, that's the most covert way to sneak people in at night and put them in the enemy's backyard without landing helicopters or trying to land boats with noisy motors and stuff. But the other thing is, if you got a bunch of soldiers you got to train and they've never been in combat before, your question is, how will they really respond in combat? General Jim Gavin, the youngest American general in World War II, commander of the 82nd Airborne Division, put it this way. He says, show me a man who'll jump out of an airplane, I'll show you a man who'll fight. And so if you screen these guys, anybody who doesn't want to jump is somebody you don't want with you. And if they do jump, well, you know they got this far on the courage scale. Hopefully they'll stick with you. Those are Vietnamese parachute wings, and on the left, and that's a Vietnamese parachute diploma. This is kind of an interesting thing. It's diplomacy. We still do this today at Special Forces. We go to a foreign country, teach their guys how to jump out of an airplane, and then we have a graduation ceremony, and they give us a diploma. I'm serious, this is how it works. But anyway, it's diplomacy, so we do it. We're all very proud of it, but that's Dad's Vietnamese wings and his Vietnamese parachute school diploma. He taught the class, but it's still cool to have a diploma. Meanwhile, the family shipped out to Okinawa. Remember, we were all in Hawaii, but the group's going to be at Okinawa, and the Army says families move up. And dads aren't there. All the moms got to get down and get their transportation tickets. We didn't fly back in those days. We all went on a ship called the General Daniel L. Sultan. And that's my mom, my 2 sisters, and me. And we got to Okinawa, we found out that an Army captain is so wealthy beyond the wildest dreams that we could afford a houseboy and a maid. And actually, the U.S. military command explained to us, it's not just a luxury. They practically twisted my mom's arm into doing it because they said there's a lot of displaced and unemployed people here in Okinawa. It is a great step to recovery if you will simply hire these people at a nominal salary because it keeps their families fed and it's recovery for them. So anyway, we all had a wait staff. That's a little certificate for crossing the international date line. That makes you a golden dragon. By God, I'm a golden dragon at the age of 3. That's my name right in the middle there. So they're going to do the training. We're all done with communication. We're all done with parachute schooling for now. We've got to find a place to train these guys. And they choose Nha Trang. The CIA had already gone up there and picked a camp. Matting popped on over from Okinawa to check it out and give a stamp of approval. But Nha Trang is halfway up the, I'm losing my laser here. Anyway, Nha Trang is, oh, there it is. Yeah. Nha Trang is halfway up the South Vietnamese coast. By the way, most Americans have no idea how big Vietnam is and think that it's a small country. It is not. Now that North Vietnam and South Vietnam are combined in one country, it is as big as California, Oregon, and Washington together. It's equivalent to the U.S. West Coast. Most people don't get that. Anyway, they needed an airfield for parachute jumps. They needed mountains for mountaineering training. They needed jungle to train people on patrolling. They needed the ocean and river because they're going to teach people not to be scuba divers, but to be combat swimmers, to be able to swim in off a rubber boat and with snorkels and paddles and fins, get in and out. They wanted someplace a long ways from headquarters, 250 miles from Saigon. They don't want Vietnamese generals visiting. They don't want American generals. They don't want anybody visiting. So Nha Trang is a long ways from anywhere. It also has an army camp there that already has a Vietnamese commando battalion stationed there. And you know the term hide in plain sight? If they put them into a new camp somewhere, all the locals will come around and say, what's this new military unit? So there's already a 500-man commando battalion there in Nha Trang. So they bring these 58 guys in and put them in their own barracks in the same camp. Nobody notices. And called hiding in plain sight. And that's what they did. There's Nha Trang right there. It's got a beautiful beach. There's the South China Sea. It is the most beautiful beach that I've been to in my life. And I've been to the Riviera, and I've been to Waikiki, and I've been to Florida in Key West. That is the most beautiful beach you can imagine. Here's the airfield. It's huge. Here's the city. There are not very many good highways in Vietnam, but it's the railroad coming in. You see what looks like a hangman's noose? There's no depot. The train comes right into town, goes around that loop, switches the switch, and goes back out. And in the middle of that, there's a Catholic cathedral, because it's a Catholic country. And just a few other things to mention about Nha Trang. Very desirable place to do the training. You go to a little place called Phu Xuan. It's actually right up here. Here's Nha Trang. Here's the Song Kai River. You got to go across the bridge. Here's Phu Xuan, this little village up here. There's a camp. It's got rifle ranges. It's got its own mountain. It's got its own rock walls to climb on. This is Les Rooper, the medic, with a big old knife. He has climbed to the very pinnacle of the mountain on the camp at Phu Xuan. Great place to train. That's the camp today. It was used as a Vietnamese military camp after the war, and it is now an emergency medical clinic. And I strolled right through the front gate. It was kind of interesting, assertiveness. There were Vietnamese guards posted everywhere. They're supposed to keep visitors out. And I was in civilian clothes, but I took what I called a command posture and walked right through the gate like I knew what I was doing. They did not stop me. They followed me everywhere through the camp, quietly, with their rifles on their shoulders. It was like leading a detail. I walked everywhere through the camp, then we walked out through the gate, and they resumed their guard post. There's something you can do with body language. Anyway, that's the view of the camp. It has electric lights now that I don't think they had back then. And that's a little hill called Nui San. It's a promontory. It's a beautiful view from up there. And it was practical. First of all, they used it as a backstop for the rifle ranges. When you shoot rifles and machine guns, you want to know where the bullets are going to end up at. You don't want them sailing 4 miles and hitting somebody on a bicycle. So all the rifle ranges use that hill as a backstop. And then when they're not shooting, then they can go rock climbing on there and learn to be mountaineers. That's the airfield at Nha Trang. This is kind of a cool picture. I stumbled upon it. But this is right in the transit. That's the airfield on the right with all its runways. But in this picture, there is a Vietnamese airplane, C-47, on the runway. Then there is also a U.S. Air Force C-47 on the runway. And right behind it is a French Air Force C-47. So this picture had to be taken within a narrow window, maybe a month, when the Americans were arriving, but the French hadn't quite left and the Vietnamese were coming in. So I'm guessing that's late 1954. But that's Nha Trang Airfield. Those are the mountains and jungle to the west. Those are serious mountains and jungle. Our guys on the 14th had operated in Korea, that operated in the Philippines, and they trained on Maui. And the first patrol they did was 4 days, week-long patrol was 4 days overdue coming back out of the mountains. And boy, they were ready to launch a search and rescue effort for them and everything. No problem, it just turned out Americans had never encountered terrain and vegetation like Central Vietnam before. Every step of the way you had to slash lines with a machete. They'd never seen anything like that in the Philippines or Maui. So anyway, there it is. They weren't allowed to take pictures for the most part. So Dad sent us postcards. That's the bridge over the Sun Kai River. They commuted across it every day. And that's the beach at Nha Trang. Those are 2 postcards. Last year I went to Nha Trang. Now there's 2 bridges instead of 1. That's the same beautiful beach at Nha Trang. It was a coincidence, but all the team was Christian and half the team was Catholic. And so there was only one Christian church in Nha Trang, and that was a Catholic cathedral. So they went to Mass every Sunday at the cathedral, and all of their Vietnamese students were also Catholic. So they went there. And the Army hates to give you money to eat on the economy. If they can find a way to beat you out of it, they'll do that. So this is the Grand Hotel. The Army signed a contract with the Grand Hotel to provide 3 meals a day to the 14th Special Forces Detachment, so they'd go in and eat there and not be able to get any per diem money from the Army. Guys, every one of them wrote home about it in the letters. We just got cheated. But they'd go there at least for breakfast and dinner meal. It was the same place as today. The Catholic cathedral was shut down for about 20 years by the Vietnamese government, and then reopened, and so you can attend Mass there now. And the Grand Hotel is now a youth hostel run by the government. The team got a boarding house on their own in Nha Trang. Sounds kind of crazy, but there wasn't a U.S. military camp, and they didn't want to be too deeply embedded with their students. You want to give them some space, a little bit of arm's length. You want to be able to talk among yourselves about training strategies and stuff. So they rented an entire boarding house, lock, stock, and barrel, just for the team. It was at 39 Duong Yersin. Duong means boulevard. Yersin was a very famous French doctor, much like Louis Pasteur, who fought epidemics in Vietnam in the 19th century. So it's named for him. And since then, I went to find it, and it's been torn down for a modern apartment house. Here's the actual training plan for Nha Trang. I'm going to do it on time. Boy, I better move along. Okay. Anybody bored yet? No. You're still with me. Okay. That's the actual. That's back before. That's before Xerox machines. That's back before Office 365 and PowerPoint. Anyway, a draftsman went ahead and hand colored everyone. But that is the cover. The whole training plan was classified, but that's the cover separated from it, and everything hand colored. The training program for the Vietnamese Special Forces conducted by the 14th SFOD. And I don't want to make Army training NCOs out of all you guys, but if you understand the concept of how you go about it, first there are basic skills, and that's what everybody has to do, and it's something you got to be able to do on your own. It's an individual skill. Everyone has to parachute. Everybody has to stay physically fit. Everybody has to know how to navigate. You got to be able to read a map and use a compass. Everybody's got to be able to hit a target with a rifle, and everybody needs to survive. Then there's advanced skills. Like I said, there's different jobs within the team. So somebody needs to learn intelligence. Somebody needs to learn planning. Somebody's got to be a medic. Somebody's got to learn how to blow things up. And then finally, you bring these Vietnamese teams together, and there's things they have to do as a group. They have to infiltrate into the enemy's backyard together without being detected, without being caught. There's procedures to that. They have to know how to go out on patrol to find the bad guys, spot the bad guys. They have to know tactics, how to attack, how to retreat under pressure, and finally, how to get out of there, exfiltration. Those are group skills. So they attack those as 3 different sets of subjects. And here's some of these are actual photos from the mission, some are from stock photos from a few years later. But that's a train model. Every time you have the paratroopers jump, you bring them all together, and you build them a little sand table, show them exactly, here's the drop zone. When you get there, there's going to be a road on the right, and there's going to be a creek on the left. This is the direction the airplane is going to fly, from this side to this side. On the street to the right, there's 3 houses on one side and 1 on the other. At the far end of the drop zone, there's a road with a couple more buildings. Every paratrooper gets to see that and memorize that. So you jump out in pitch blackness, you don't find the other guys, you start walking, and you come across a creek, you know you're off the drop zone to the left. Start walking and you find a road, well, you got to figure out, did you go across the road at the end? Anyway, that's something you do. Teach every one of those before you go. That's rappelling, which teaches people how to descend from a cliff. It's also another continuous courage test. Do it about every day. Make sure that you still got the nerve to do this kind of work. Training heavy weapons on the left, that's a US M1919 Browning machine gun. Patrolling on the right, they're headed down the trail into the jungle. In every training event that they do, they involve an airborne operation, meaning parachute, because they don't want that skill to get extinct. They've already done their 5 jumps and they know what they're doing, but whether they're going out on a survival exercise, whether we're going out to a rifle range, whether we're going out on a patrolling exercise for 3 days, you parachute in. At first, the Americans do all the training and supervision, and they try to make the Vietnamese take that over, and it's difficult. They're very reluctant to take over any leadership role in this thing, and I'll touch more on that in a moment. It goes back to colonial days. That's the Vietnamese jumping there. Here's what they find, and bear in mind, they have just come freshly from Thailand and Taiwan, where they're dealing with professional soldiers, well-trained and highly motivated. Vietnamese marksmanship is so bad, they can't hit a target to save their lives. So the American sergeants asked the obvious question, when's the last rifle marksmanship you got when you were in the French Army? They never got basic rifle marksmanship while they were colonial soldiers in the French Army. They were never taught to shoot or to disassemble and clean their weapons. So you wonder why the French lost. Anyway, it's the same thing, physical fitness. These guys can't run 2 miles. These guys can't do 30 push-ups. So the Americans realize a lot of remedial things, but it's a shock because Thai soldier can outrun you. You might be 2 feet shorter than you, he'll outrun you, or he'll lose face. Thais will outshoot you on a rifle range. Thais can't wait to get in the plane and jump. Anyway, these are all symptoms of being a colonial force. During the time they were in the French Army, they had Vietnamese battalions with French commanders and French sergeants leading things. Many of these Vietnamese are officers or senior sergeants from the French. There's captains and majors and master sergeants. It turns out that that was sort of a diplomatic perk given to them because they came from middle class or upper class families, so they were given rank, but they were never permitted to make a decision. If there's a Vietnamese major there and a French sergeant, the French sergeant will make the decision and give the instructions. These guys were window dressing for a colonial army, and they had no leadership experience at all. It can be overcome, but it was something very unexpected. And this was repeated over and over in the letters back. Every time we teach the Vietnamese to do something, some Vietnamese major gets mad and said, the French never made us do this. Why do you make us do this? And of course our answer is, because we want you to win a war. They have more challenges, attrition within the team. There's a lot of diseases out there. One of the Americans came down with dengue fever. One American broke a foot in a parachute jump. One American broke a leg mountaineering. So 3 guys get medevaced out. We found the radio operators, one of the radio operators had medevaced, so we had a call for 2 more radio operators from Okinawa to join so we could continue the training. Very poor condition of the weapons and ammunition left by the French. We had to cherry pick the ammunition that looked serviceable, and the weapon sergeants had to take apart a lot of, they're actually American weapons used by the French, not maintained, and then left behind to rust. Anyway, the American weapon sergeants did a lot of work with their Vietnamese students to refurbish the weapons and make them usable. And a very deteriorated condition of the French munitions, explosives left behind. Very serious. Melanite, you probably have never heard of that before. Melanite was a World War I French high explosive in the very early days of experimenting with high explosives. Its primary ingredient was picric acid, which unfortunately causes the rest of the compound to deteriorate rapidly and precipitates out. It was used in World War I. The last of it was manufactured before World War II and the Germans invaded. The French had used it in their Indochina War from 1946 to 1954 and left it to the Vietnamese Army in huge quantities. It's the only explosive that they left them. In February of 1957, and I don't believe my father's team knew this, 700 tons of melanite exploded at an ammunition dump near Saigon and killed scores of Vietnamese soldiers and Vietnamese civilian employees, but it was kept under wraps. And MAG tried but was unable to obtain fresh U.S. replacements for the explosives. So here's the quandary. The explosives are necessary to the training. You might drop these guys into North Vietnam 2 weeks after we're done training, and they need to know how to blow things up. So Dad complained to MAG about the status of the explosives and said, you've got to get something. Doesn't have to be a lot, you got to get something and get it in here. His counterpart was a Major Ted Wheeler, who was the advisor to a Vietnamese infantry division stationed nearby. And Wheeler said, we won't use any of the ammunition that's issued to us. We're doing only dry fire training with the Vietnamese because the ammunition is too dangerous. But a difference in circumstances. Wheeler is training Vietnamese infantry for a war that might never happen. Dad's training Vietnamese Special Forces guys for a mission that might happen next month. So anyway, he's going to find a way to do it. Mag comes back and says, it's ugly, it's deteriorated, and it doesn't meet U.S. standards, but it's not all unsafe. You need to sort through it and pick the best material and continue to use it and quit complaining. In October, as they get close to graduation, they schedule what's called a force-on-force exercise, and what that means, you're actually operating against a real enemy. Another unit is assigned to fight with you. Obviously, you don't use live ammunition, you use blanks, but you go out and attack each other and defend from each other, so on and so forth. 58 Vietnamese Special Forces candidates, they're going to attack the 15th Light Division. A couple hundred troops, a 200-man company are going to play the enemy. And Major Wheeler, whom I mentioned, and my dad are going to be the umpires for this whole thing. The exercise was scheduled for the 21st of October, 1957, with the 15th Light Division traveling down the Honba Mountain Road in a vehicle convoy, and the Special Forces students lying in wait to ambush the convoy. You don't need to know this. I hope you don't need to know this. But if you're going to ambush a vehicular convoy, you want to find them on preferably a winding road, a cul-de-sac, someplace with limited view forward and behind, and someplace they can't turn around. Then you initiate the ambush, not by shooting at everybody in the trucks. You initiate the ambush with something that will halt or destroy the lead vehicle in the column, then another that will destroy the last vehicle in the column, and now they can't leave, and you got them. So they take 2 small melinite charges to simulate that at the beginning and end of the convoy as it enters the kill zone. There's the kill zone on the left on the Honba Mountain Road. You can see where they've chosen to ambush this convoy as they come in. On the map it's shown it's about 12 miles southwest of Nha Trang. And the ambush never gets started. With that very first melinite charge, as they're putting it in place, detonates prematurely. Sergeant Rupert was holding it, Roxanne Ruddy's fiance, severed his right arm. And my dad and the Vietnamese interpreter, who was also the Vietnamese medical doctor, standing next to my dad. My dad and the Vietnamese doctor are both killed in the explosion. They are now in desperate straits because one American medic is severely wounded and in deep shock, and the Vietnamese MD, Vietnamese Marine Corps officer, is dead. So that leaves Chalmers Archer as the only medic on the site. He's got to stabilize Rupert. He tries to treat my father and the Vietnamese captain, who are beyond help, but Archer tries anyway. They send in a radio message. The Vietnamese send up a C-47 from Saigon, breaks down at the runway at Nha Trang, and can't get them out of there. So Rupert has to wait overnight for a U.S. Navy aircraft to come up from Saigon and pick them up on the morning of October 22nd. Fran Ruddy solved the problem the way that a good Special Forces sergeant will solve the problems. My dad was a West Pointer and an officer, knows how to give orders, knows how to follow orders. He died following a stupid order. Fran Ruddy said no more of that. That night, he and Earl Kalani go run deck cord all through the ammunition dump and blow up the entire Nha Trang ammunition dump, blame it on the Viet Cong, and get Major Wheeler to swear to it and put it in a written report to Saigon. You might be smiling in the front row. Get 2 sergeants to do it, get a commissioned officer to swear to it, and you're good to go. I'm being a little facetious on a grave subject here. Ruddy must have been under severe stress. He just lost his team commander, a good friend, and he just effectively lost his future son-in-law. Rupert was his daughter's fiancé. But it gets more complicated. At dawn on October 22nd, 3 terrorist bombs go off in Saigon, 2 of them in front of American barracks, and 1 of them in front of what's called the U.S. Information Service Library. It's a diplomatic outreach. We create libraries with books about democracy and freedom. Anyway, the Viet Cong targeted all 3, set off the bombs simultaneously, and wounded 15 more Americans. So now there's a bigger medevac problem than just Lester Rupert, and it takes a U.S. aircraft the rest of the day to get these people evacuated to Clark Field in the Philippines. The Nha Trang incident is hidden from view. First of all the press, there's no press in Nha Trang. All the press sees the carnage in Saigon, and all the New York Times and San Francisco Chronicle articles about that. Mag wants it that way, They don't want any attention to the Nha Trang incident. One, because the mission is secret, nobody's supposed to know any Americans are in Nha Trang. Second of all, Mags to blame. They're the ones said to use the explosives, they're safe. They don't want, they went to great lengths over the years, now I won't go off on tangents, they went to great lengths to conceal that over the years to follow. 14th Detachment completes their training and redeploys to Okinawa in December, minus my dad and Sergeant Rupert. After that, I'll try to speed up here, I know I'm coming up on time limit. If you gotta go, you're welcome to go, you don't have to apologize. If you need to use the restroom, you don't have to apologize for that, you just go do that. The Vietnamese at that point take over their own training. As an honor to my father, they named that first class Cycle Cramer. And then those graduates trained the next 3 cycles, cycle B, C, and D. They reached a strength of 300 soldiers by 1960, but they didn't stay at Nha Trang. Diem becomes increasingly concerned about coups against his rule because there's several more coups down there. So he withdraws the Special Forces Battalion from Nha Trang to Saigon to personally protect the White House. And so they shift down there. We're fine with the Vietnamese following our course of instruction and teaching their own class, but we want to verify that they're meeting our standards. So for the next 3 cycles, as each cycle nears graduation, we send 2 sergeants from Okinawa. You've already met them before, that's Everett White and Earl Kalani. They go over each time for a couple of months, temporary duty, just check the training, make sure the Vietnamese can all hit targets, that they're jumping out of planes, that everything they're doing is in accordance with our program of instruction. That's the first observation group in Saigon. Good news and bad news. They do some limited reconnaissance along the Cambodian-Laotian borders. They do enter enemy territory like we had trained them to do. They never do deploy into North Vietnam. The coup threat against GM becomes too great for him to risk having them gone that long. They do successfully protect him from 2 different coup attempts. But on the bad side, this actually aggravates the Americans. He uses them to suppress some Buddhist protests. You recall that the Buddhists protested oppression under the Diem regime. He was Catholic. Several Buddhist priests lit themselves on fire in the city squares in Saigon. They started doing civil disobedience against the government, and Diem used them to crack their heads, which the U.S. ambassador in Mag sternly disapproved of. That's not what we trained them for. Meanwhile, we shift our focus to Laos, and everybody's forgotten about this now. I shouldn't say everybody. But Laos was really the pot that was boiling over at this point. Vietnam, the communist threats still look distant, but in Laos, the communists are actually actively overthrowing the government. And we sent U.S. Special Forces into Laos to train the Royal Laotian Army to fight back against the communists. They were French colonial troops, so you probably have a pretty good idea where they were at with marksmanship and discipline and so on. Anyway, the North Vietnamese infiltrated Laos and Cambodia. Red China was threatening Taiwan. You might remember the Quemoy and Matsu incidents. The U.S. Navy deployed in the Taiwan Straits. We called them Operations Hotfoot and Operations White Star, and they were absolutely secret at the time. But we sent individual Special Forces teams over there. 3 American Special Forces soldiers were killed in Laos, and that was not recognized at the time. 1 American Captain, Walter Moon, was captured in a battle and executed in cold blood. Forgot about that too. Change in direction. 1961, John F. Kennedy becomes the president. He's fascinated with Special Forces. He authorizes them, the Green Beret. It had been prohibited beforehand. He says, no, by God, you are America's honor guard. You guys wear these Green Berets. He got the gist of all that guerrilla warfare stuff I taught you about earlier. But in a sense, he changed it 180 degrees. So this was good news and bad news, having the president get behind us. If you remember his New Frontier platform, new visions for the world, in terms of diplomacy, he created a Peace Corps that would be American volunteers. We go to third world countries, impoverished places, open schoolhouses, drill wells, teach them proper cooking and sanitation techniques, things like that. He looked at the Special Forces as being the military equivalent to the Peace Corps. And so he tremendously expands the Special Forces, which is good and bad. It means they become a more powerful force, but it also means it's a real strain. We're engaged in combat overseas. How are we going to train the new guys in mass? Also, he changes their mission from offensive to defensive. Up till now, all focus has been, we're going to parachute into North Korea or Red China or Laos or Cambodia and rattle the bad guys. He turns around and says, we want you to train the South Vietnamese to defend themselves. Most people don't get that, especially civilians, but it's a 180-degree change of mission. Bad things continue to happen. On November 1st, 1963, President No Jin Jem is overthrown by a military coup. The United States pretends they are shocked by this, but in fact, we approved it, and we provided money to the coup leaders to make it happen. Jiem and his brother are assassinated at the end of the coup, even though assurances were supposedly given to the United States ambassador that would not happen. It goes very, very badly for the Vietnamese Special Forces. Lieutenant Colonel Lee Quang Tong was the commander of the Vietnamese Special Forces, graduate of Hank Cramer. He is executed the same day. There he is, glad-handing Vice President Lyndon Johnson. A few days later, he's dead. On November 22nd, President Kennedy is assassinated. Tremendous, I don't have to tell you what a shock that was to America. We still revere him. There's an eternal flame in his grave. Sergeant Major Francis Ruddy, Dad's team sergeant, is the NCOIC of the funeral detail. And in a surprise move that nobody planned or nobody approved, as they lowered the president into his resting place and put the, whatever you call that, cover on it, Ruddy extemporaneously removed the Green Beret from his head and placed it on the president's grave because Kennedy had given us the Green Beret. He's still famous for that to this day. The Vietnamese purged all of the Diem loyalists, which means all of the graduates of my father's class, from the first observation group. They form a new Vietnamese Special Forces. They call it Luc Luong Doc Viet, which is Vietnamese Special Forces. It is filled with ex-colonial guys who know how to skim money. The Americans pay the troops. The Vietnamese officers skim the pay. They know how to avoid combat. They did that for years under the French. Anyway, they are terrible. And they're so bad that the American Special Forces say that LLDB does not stand for Luc Luong Doc Viet. It stands for lousy little dirty bug out. And they're useless to us. So we move on doing other things. First, the defensive role. We send Special Forces teams into Vietnam to organize the rural villages for their own self-defense. For the most part, they are not ethnic Vietnamese. The ethnic Vietnamese primarily live in the lowlands and in the cities. The strategic terrain that needs to be held is in the mountains. Those are indigenous tribes, equivalent to Native American groups here. They speak a different language base. We know them as mountain yards. Today, the largest group in the United States are known as the Hmong, H-M-O-N-G, but actually there are a lot of other individual tribes, the Rades, the Brules, a lot of different tribes. Anyway, they don't particularly like the Vietnamese government, but they don't like the communists either. So we train them to defend their own villages. We call it the Civilian Irregular Defense Groups. And this establishes a program in which 12-man U.S. Special Forces teams go out to these rural villages, help them build a defensive perimeter around the camp, around the village. The Americans lived with the Vietnamese for a year at a time, far remote and removed from the rest of the U.S. forces. And that's something that still makes U.S. Special Forces stand apart. That's Captain Ron Shackleton from the 1st Special Forces Group at a little village called Bunanao in 1962. The Vietnamese never launched combat troops into North Vietnam, but they formed their own equivalent to the CIA. It's called the Strategic and Technical Director. The guy in charge, he's a survivor. He's one of Dad's students, and he survived the purge. His name is No Tay Lien. He lived through the whole war and died in Los Angeles about 10 years ago. He heads up the Vietnamese CIA. They send individual spies in small teams into North Vietnam in what the CIA calls Op 34. And all of them are unsuccessful. The North Vietnamese catch every one of the teams or every one of the agents. They don't kill them. They put them under duress and make them go ahead and send in reports saying, yep, we landed safely. Okay, we're good. We need some food and rifles dropped to us, so on and so forth. Some of these teams did not send arrest signals. They just sent messages the way the North Vietnamese told them to. Other teams put in what's called a duress signal. What is, when this situation, when you got a gun to your head, there's just one mistake that you make. There's a particular typo. There's some signal that you put in the message saying, don't buy this, I've got a gun to my head. A number of the Vietnamese agents did that, and yet the Vietnamese CIA overlooked it. And they, midway through the war, they thought all their teams were successful. The suspicion did not come from the Vietnamese. Only minor suspicion came from the CIA. The absolute proof and the end of the show came from the nationalist Chinese. The civil air transport pilots I was telling you about, they dropped these guys in. But then when the resupply requests came back, you know, we need you to drop supplies at this location, the Chinese would fly their Curtiss Commando at night at a low altitude to go to that location. Vietnamese and CIA did not know that Nationalist Chinese had radar threat detectors in their aircraft. A couple of civil air transport planes got shot down while they were dropping supplies to what was supposedly their teams. Civil air transport put radar threat detectors in their aircraft, and when they came into these drop zones in the middle of jungle, hundreds of miles from any town, lit up with anti-aircraft radars waiting on the site. The Nationalist Chinese came back and told us, "Are you nuts? Your teams are under the control of the North Vietnamese," and the civil air transport refused to fly any further missions in North Vietnam. Then and only then did this stop. But anyway, that's a shame. So we took it over. When we realized the Vietnamese aren't going to get this done, but we need Vietnamese to do it, we formed what's called a Studies and Observation Group. Once again, it's an ambiguous title, but it was a hybrid organization. They handpicked American Special Forces officers and experienced sergeants, teamed them up with indigenous people, usually not South Vietnamese. Many of them were Khmer, Cambodian. You're going to cross an enemy territory, bring locals. So Laotians, Khmer, some North Vietnamese, and hill tribesmen, mountainards who've been there before. So usually the teams were those people with a couple of American leaders. This is a unique team. Anyway, they would go by helicopter or parachute into Cambodia and Laos. It is rumored they went into North Vietnam, but if so, that is not yet declassified. And this was called Op 35. This team is very remarkable. On the left is Captain Rob, the team commander. On the right is Master Sergeant Bob Ramsey, still alive. He was one of my ROTC instructors at the University of Arizona. The two gentlemen in the middle are North Vietnamese. They are North Vietnamese soldiers who have defected to the U.S. Special Forces, and they parachuted into Laos to observe the Ho Chi Minh Trail and scout out North Vietnamese base camps. And some of the higher-ranking officers took Ramsey and Captain Rob aside and said, "Do you trust these guys, North Vietnamese turncoats?" And to this day, Bob Ramsey laughs and says, "Absolutely, because if we're caught, they're in a lot more trouble than we are." They vetted them to make sure they weren't plants. No, they were North Vietnamese deserters. So if they were caught by the North Vietnamese, yes?
Do you have any idea how old those boys are?
I don't mean this to sound like a cliche. Sometimes Asian ages are hard to guess, but I'm guessing these young men are between 20 and 22. They've got a couple of years' experience in the North Vietnamese Army. The reason they were, I don't know their names, but the reason they were recruited was they had traveled up and down. The Ho Chi Minh Trail was the North Vietnamese supply line that passed through Laos, which was theoretically beyond our reach. They had traveled up and down the trail many times and defected from there, so they knew where the North Vietnamese base camps were and so on and so forth. But the North Vietnamese would draft soldiers as young as 14 and 15 years old. So I'm guessing they're military veterans, and I'm guessing they're no older than 22. Just a guess. And there's just another shot, a rare shot. They didn't take many pictures, but that's kind of a Hollywood op for two U.S. Special Forces sergeants and ethnic mountainards. What tribe they're from, I'm not sure. But anyway, you usually get various indigenous tribes, but you usually make your whole team from the same tribe, preferably the same village, because they already have relationships and work together. It gets increasingly interesting. The Vietnamese Army Special Forces never go into North Vietnam in force, but the Vietnamese Navy creates sea commandos called the Viet Hai under the general guidance of the CIA, and they go north. They've got scuba divers and snorkelers, and they go raiding the coast of North Vietnam in early 1964 to blow up North Vietnamese torpedo boats. This is called Op 37. You won't be given a test, so you don't have to remember all those ops. And again, absolutely, totally classified that they're doing it and we're behind it. But it has serious, serious unintended consequences. Does anybody recall the phrase, the Gulf of Tonkin incident? Here's where we're going. They keep raiding these North Vietnamese torpedo boat bases, Vinh Son, Hoa Ran, Vinh, up along the coast. And the North Vietnamese get kind of fed up with it. So they have torpedo boats, and they figure out the operational, the MO of the Viet Hai. So they go out to intercept them, but two U.S. Navy destroyers in the Gulf of Tonkin doing something totally unrelated, but the North Vietnamese don't know it's unrelated. So the North Vietnamese attack the USS Maddox up here on the 2nd of August. The Maddox responds by linking up with the Turner Joy. They go on station. On August 4th, they think they're attacked in the middle of the night. One of those crazy things that happens in war. They weren't under attack. A huge windstorm blew up, and the wave tops on the Gulf of Tonkin got so high that it started giving radar returns on the destroyer's radar that resembled high-speed boats moving in from the north. So they thought they were attacked the second night. But anyway, the irony of the thing is, Navy destroyers didn't even know what was going on. They just know they got attacked by North Vietnamese torpedo boats, supposedly unprovoked. It goes to this word gets up to the United States government. I don't mean to take political positions or anything else, just observing. The United States government knew that this was not unprovoked. The destroyer captains didn't know what was going on, but the White House did. Anyway, President Johnson took that attack on the destroyers to Congress as an unprovoked attack on international waters by the North Vietnamese, got the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which was tantamount to a declaration of war, and authorized Johnson to do anything he needed to defeat the North Vietnamese. So, a law of unintended consequences. This started with some Vietnamese, with North Vietnamese special forces guys in Nha Trang with my dad in 1957, ends up with these Vietnamese sea commandos doing botched raids on the north and triggering a wider war. I won't talk about the whole war. Thank God, we're getting close. We're getting close to the end. The rise and fall of U.S. Special Forces in Vietnam, Nha Trang becomes their headquarters for the rest of the war. We grow to 5,000 men. That's still small compared to 500,000 American troops in Vietnam. We grow to 5,000. As Americans get disillusioned with the war, the Army also gets disillusioned with the Special Forces. 5th Group gets pulled out of Vietnam. That's the title of the unit. In the closing years, the 1st Group, my group, Okinawa, goes in with the last 2 advisory missions. Then finally the war ends and the 1st Special Forces Group and many other Special Forces units are deactivated. We are tired of the war, we're tired of Special Forces. So I'll go into the closing parts here. I call this echoes, but in the course of my journey to write this book and find out what really happened, I've been in touch with the family members of each of the guys on the team. And here are their stories. Les Rupert, very sad story, lost his right arm in the explosion, but Roxanne Ruddy broke off the engagement with him when she realized that she was going to marry a cripple. Very sad thing, he went to Walter Reed Hospital for rehabilitation. This is personal family stuff. But to this day, family members pass on how angry their fathers were that Roxanne dropped Sergeant Rupert. Felt it was very cold. He had given her his car. He had sent his money home to Okinawa with her. Anyway, that's all personal stuff that I'm not involved with, but it's a very sad part of Rupert's story. He was medically retired from the Army. Strange enough, he became a sport parachutist. He won a number of competitions with no right arm, and he died in Florida in 2006. Ray LaBombard didn't last very long at all. Our guerrilla chief, they were practicing water parachute jumps off of Okinawa in January of 1959. Something went wrong, and he rests at Arlington National Cemetery. Francis J. Ruddy, I mentioned that he placed his green beret on JFK's grave during the funeral. When Robert F. Kennedy was assassinated in 1968, Ethel Kennedy requested that he be her personal military escort at RFK's funeral, and that's him and Ethel Kennedy right there. In speaking with his family, he became estranged from everyone except his wife. Didn't want to talk about the war. He was bitter about the war at the end, didn't explain why to anyone, and cut off contact with the rest of the people from the team. And I think that it may have been a long-term remorse over the breakup of Les Rupert and Roxanne Ruddy. Earl Kalani, quite the character. Everybody loved Earl. He served 3 more tours of duty in Vietnam. He received a crippling wound in 1968 outside of Phu Bai. He was shot up so badly over the years in Korea and Vietnam that he went through a series of, I believe, 7 surgeries. And in 1974, he died in a military hospital in Korea while under surgery. He's buried at the Punch Bowl. Unfortunately, his name is not authorized to be on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial because he did not die in Vietnam, and they cannot attribute his death directly to the wounds in Vietnam because he had so many from so many places. I visit him every time I go to Hawaii. Fred Williamson stayed on forever, did 3 tours of duty in Vietnam, won a very special award. It's not a combat award, it's an award for saving someone else's life at severe risk of your own. It's called the Soldier's Medal. Very rare. And He's buried in Sutter, California, at a veteran cemetery. That's him about 1964 with what we call the duck hunter camouflage fatigues, the bush hat, and a very early model M16 rifle, or AR-15. Don Stetson, he went back to Laos. I mentioned those American soldiers who were killed in Laos. He was on Captain Moon's team. He survived the ambush that killed 3 members of his team. He sent in the contact report asking for reinforcements. We can only estimate his story after that, but it's very telling. He left the Army in 1964, 2 years short of retirement. He said, "I quit." And he cut off pretty much all contact except for being a ham radio operator, his true love. And he died in Churchill, Nevada in 1991. Never told anybody why I left the Army, but I can guess. Don Reynolds, and this touches on an interesting subject. In the old days, we didn't know the term PTSD. I don't call it PTSD because post-traumatic stress disorder suggests there's something wrong with you. In my personal opinion, it's post-traumatic stress. There's nothing wrong with you. You're just having a very normal reaction to some extremely unnormal experiences. Anyway, people didn't understand that back then. But Don Reynolds started acting erratic, and then he became downright crazy. He was medically retired in 1963 and placed into the mental ward of a VA hospital in Pennsylvania. He was never released. He died, was taken down the road to Indiantown Gap National Cemetery. Bobby Newman, I love this guy. He did 3 more tours in Vietnam. He became a pilot, flew fixed wing and flew helicopters. He earned 37 air medals. The Army really discouraged mustaches at that time and absolutely prohibited having handlebar mustaches. That is Bobby Newman receiving the Silver Star Medal from General Westmoreland, the head guy in charge. And he is glaring at Bobby Newman with his handlebar mustache, who was glaring right back at Westy like, "What are you going to do about it?" My only comment is, since Westy's eyebrows were almost as bushy as Bobby Newman's mustache, I don't think he can complain much. He retired, I forgot which year, but he was a highly qualified Special Forces aviator in the UH-60 Black Hawk. When the grenade invasion hired him, very unusual, they recalled him from retirement and he flew one of the lead Black Hawks in the grenade in 1983. Last man in the fight out of this team, and he now rests at Arlington. That's Everett C. White, the heavy weapons guy. He served 2 more terms in Vietnam in 1964. His wife handed him divorce papers when he got back in 1964, and pretty much cut off contact with him after that. And in the process, my visiting his daughter in Phoenix several times. His daughter went with the mom, like it usually happens. This has been a huge experience for me. I was going to find information about him to fill me in. I ended up, over several visits, relinking her with her father. But anyway, he retired as a command sergeant major in 1968, died in 2015, and I mentioned he was a sailor. He was from Gloucester. They scattered his ashes off the coast of Gloucester, Massachusetts. Chalmers Archer, very sad story. This appears to be a very sad story. Once again, I believe it is huge PTS. I mentioned that Rupert got his arm severed. My father was killed, and a Vietnamese doctor was killed. On that dark hillside that night, outside of Nha Trang, Archer was the only guy left to take care of his wounded buddy and his dead captain. And I'm not sure he ever recovered. But he was dropped from the rolls as a deserter in 1965. That's a very bad thing. Went back into the Army just long enough to ask for a retirement, and they busted into a very low rank, E4, and retired him. He became a community college professor in Virginia, wrote a couple of books, and I have to say this. One of the books was called Green Berets and the Vanguard. It's about his experiences in Southeast Asia. And if anybody has the book, or if you're interested, I have to share with you, it's a complete fantasy. His entire narrative diverges completely from the facts as are established. So, but I'm not bad-mouthing Chalmers Archer. I'm saying I think this is a severe, undiagnosed case of PTS that never got better. He died in 2014, and because of his final circumstances, he was eligible for burial at Arlington, and he's about 2 rows down from Bobby Newman. Hank First, he was the mystery man. He did extensive work for the CIA. He helped found that SOG group I was talking about, Studies and Observation Group. Nobody knows anything about him. When I wrote to the Department of the Army to find out any remaining records they had, they wrote, the Office of the Chief of Military History wrote to me and said, "We know nothing, absolutely nothing about Henry S. First. If you could give us anything, starting with the picture, we would appreciate it." mystery man. Retired as a sergeant major in 1968, buried in his hometown in Ephrata, Pennsylvania. Scott Matting, he led missions to Laos, Korea, Taiwan, and Philippines. Retired in '64 and became a prison pastor. He liked doing tough things, and so he gave tough love to Georgia prisoners for the next 20 years, telling them how to straighten out your life, then ask Jesus for forgiveness, and then maybe we'll get you out of here. And if you screw up, he'll be back in again. Anyway, he's a great prison pastor. Matting Hall at Fort Lewis, one of the headquarters buildings, is named for him. And on Friday, he will be installed as a distinguished member of the Special Forces Regiment. That's a very, very rare honor. His family is being gathered at Fort Bragg, North Carolina on Friday for that award. That's my dad. He's buried at his alma mater, the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. The name Cramer Avenue, the main road into the Special Forces compound at Fort Lewis, is named for Dad. And Cramer Drop Zone on Okinawa. It's a rough terrain drop zone, meaning you're going to get bruised when you land on that one. I don't know if they did Dad a favor by naming that one after him or not, but a lot of people have cussed Cramer ever since they landed on that thing. The last man standing is Robert Moss, the sergeant major. Lied about his age. Matting had no idea that he had a 28-year-old sergeant major. He retired from the Army in '64. He turns 92 on June 17th. And he was the guest of honor at the 1st Special Forces Group's 60th anniversary back in 2017. He's still going strong, still ornery. I'm getting real close to wrapping up now. Thank you very much for your patience. In 1982, they opened up the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. They left my father's name off the monument. And I contacted the monument and said, hey, left my father's name off the monument. At first they acted like I was crazy. Then they said, you got to go get a hold of the Army because they were in charge, or the Department of Defense, they were in charge of the names. I got a hold of the Department of Defense and said, don't complain to us, it's a private monument, you got to bring it up with them. I'm getting this. So anyway, what I did, didn't make me, I was a captain in the Army at the time, this did not make me popular with Army authorities, but I sent Freedom of Information Act requests to the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of the Army, demanding disclosure of any information about the mission in Nha Trang in 1957, including the report of my father's death. And those things by law have to be declassified at intervals. So in the letter I said, I know that many of those things were classified at the time. And for that reason I demand that you subject all those messages and documents to the declassification schedule under U.S. public law and release it to me now. And on Veterans Day of 1983, 1 year later, they added my father's name to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. That's with the red roses next to it. It's a sticky situation. The names are in chronological order, starting with the first that were lost, which they believed was 1959, going chronologically to 1975. They said, Hank, your dad's the first soldier lost in the war. To honor him that way, we would have to destroy the first panel and recreate it at great expense. And they said it might be stressful to the families of MIAs, because for the MIAs who never got the bodies back, the only remembrance they have of their father is the name on the wall. And I responded immediately. I said, this was not a contest that anybody wanted to win. So I said, put Dad's name in the first place and fit. And it worked out, must have been karma. I don't have to look for the name. He's on panel 1E, the center of the wall, and he's line 78, which is eye level with me. So when I go to visit the wall, all I have to do is walk to the center of the wall and look straight ahead, and Dad's there. I was a paratrooper and signal corps officer in the Army up to that point, and in 1984, the Army decided to reactivate Dad's old unit, the 1st Special Forces Group at Fort Lewis. And amongst all these different Special Forces guys they needed one signal corps captain to be the chief of communications, to be a signal company commander, and I got orders from the U.S. Army to report post-haste to the 1st Special Forces Group at Fort Lewis. To me, it was just an unbelievable. I couldn't believe it was happening. So that's our activation day parade at Fort Lewis. And that's me giving the salute in the center. I was the commander of the signal company. Just one small cog in the big machine. Got some closure as I interviewed all these members of the teams, their families, got letters and photographs from back then, decided that it was time to go to Vietnam. I could never go there before because from the end of the war until 1996, the Vietnamese closed up the side, would not allow Americans to come and visit. After that, Americans could come and visit, but as a military officer, I would have had to get clearance from the Pentagon to get a visa to go there, and that's not going to happen. So only since I retired was I eligible to go to Vietnam. So anyway, I took a tour with my wife, and then that Sergeant Jim Gibson standing next to me. He was one of my platoon sergeants in the Signal Company of Special Forces. He lives in Bangkok now, he's an ex-mate. And we put together a tour, and we traveled to everywhere the Dad and the 14th Special Forces Detachment were back in 1957. And then we had a special ceremony with some Vietnam veterans that laid flowers right on the site where my father was killed. And that's the place, and those are the flowers. A little bit of closure, I mentioned talking to Sergeant White's daughter, Cindy White, and instead of really me getting information from her, I kind of reconnected her with her father's career since Mom had divorced him at the end of his third Vietnam tour. And so today we don't call it a museum, it's a regimental mess at Fort Lewis, but that's Everett White and Harry Cramer's uniforms, side by side. Teammates reunited 60 years later, and I'm kind of proud of that. That finally brings us to the end. That's Dad and the whole team just before deploying to Vietnam. I hope I've taken a lot of your time. I hope I haven't bored you to death. Do you have any questions for me? If you're okay with it, I'll take a few more minutes of your time. Over these years, in those early days, there's a very special song sung among the Special Forces. For special occasions, unfortunately also sung at funerals. But Barry Sadler, in the midst of all the anti-Vietnam protests in 1966, wrote a song called The Ballad of the Green Berets. And it's our regimental song. I'll sing it for you before you go. This came out in 1966, and I remember exactly when it came out because Don O'Rourke, one of my father's teammates, drove all the way from North Carolina to New York to visit me and my mom and give us a copy of this 45 RPM record so that I could hear the Ballad of the Green Berets. I've been singing it ever since. Fighting soldiers from the sky, fearless men who jump and die, men who mean just what they say, the brave men of the Green Beret. Silver wings upon their chest, these are men, America's best. 100 men will test today, but only 3 with the Green Beret. They're trained to live off nature's land. They're trained in combat, hand to hand. Men who fight by night or day. Courage lives in the Green Beret. Silver wings upon their chest, these are men, America's best. 100 men will test one day, but only 3 with the Green Beret. Back at home, young wife waits. Her Green Beret has met his fate. He is dying for those oppressed, leaving her this last request. Put silver wings on my son's chest. Make him one of America's best. He'll be a man, he'll test one day. Have him win that Green Beret. Thank you so very much. I want to thank you for coming and to Sadie and the museum for having me. I hope to see you guys again sometime soon. Maybe they'll have me come back and have you sing some cowboy songs like I used to. If anybody's got any questions or anything you want to share, I'll stick around for a while, and that way if you've got any private questions or anything, I'll stick around here. I've got a display over there with my dad's parachute wings from Thailand and a proclamation from the New York State Assembly. Oh, and I've got an album exclusively of soldier songs, including the Ballad of the Green Berets. And if you would like to get one of my CDs of soldier songs, I've got them over there for $15. So With that, I bid you good night and thank you again for being a wonderful audience.